Well, a warm welcome to you all for joining us here for this second of our A Rocha Talks. My name is Matt Humphrey. I'm the Director of Theological Education for A Rocha. It's a delight to be doing this. It's a delight to have this wonderful group of friends joining us to discuss Godspeed, a film that I hope that you have all watched. And if you haven't watched it, please go do. It's worth watching at least once. I'm just going to take about 5 minutes, say a few quick words about A Rocha Canada, the organization that's hosting this event. Most of you will be somewhat familiar with us, but I want to say a few things about that, and then about myself, and then we'll dive in, and the film, and then we'll dive in with our panelists. And most of this hour together will be a conversation, and so we do invite your input through the chat. Go ahead, and if you have questions for the panelists, questions related to the themes of the film, please go ahead and insert those into the chat on the side, and those will be kind of moderated, and we'll ask those to our panelists. So let me say a few words to you briefly about A Rocha Canada. A Rocha Canada is part of a global network of projects of Christians working to care for creation. We are community-based, working broadly in the area of environmental conservation. And that takes shape in 21 countries around the world today and is widely adapted to fit the needs of diverse bioregions and watersheds. So what it might look like for A Rocha to be working in Lebanon, as they are right now, is going to be different than it looks outside Vancouver. It's going to be different than it looks in rural France. Then it's going to be different than it looks in Africa. If you want to learn a bit more about the work of A Rocha International, you can look at arocha.org to hear about some of those projects. In Canada, we build on this mission of transforming people and places through showing God's love for creation. That's our vision, that's our mission, that's why we exist. And we do that principally in 3 study centers, one outside Vancouver, British Columbia, one in Hamilton, Ontario, and another in Winnipeg, Manitoba. We also have a number of smaller partnered projects in other parts of the country. And for more on that and what we do, you can check out our website, arocha.ca. But these 3 centers really work to demonstrate our commitments to care for creation and to do so out of a deep Christian faith. In the site in BC, where I lived with my family for 7 years before moving here to Victoria, if you were to visit, you would see a thriving field study center with a team of biologists going down to the river, and they'd be studying amphibians or fish or birds or grasses in the river and trying to understand the changes that are happening to the ecosystems that we live in. You would also see an education center where groups of school children are running through the rain to learn about compost or food chains or biodiversity or environmental ethics. You would see a small-scale organic farm with a small team of farmers and interns growing vegetables for several hundred families through a community-supported agriculture project. You would also see a residential facility where staff and interns and families live together, share meals, and grapple with big questions about how we live well in this time and place. Mm-hmm. And all of this as a kind of embodiment of our faith, as well as a demonstration plot. We're not saying this is the only way to live faithfully, but perhaps this can spur some of your imagination for what it looks like to live into our faith and into the call of God for us in the world today. So each of the panelists joining us now have a different relationship to A Rocha, and I'm kind of less interested in how that is than in how they share this common faith, this common set of values, and how they spur our imagination on living in place. If you're, as I say, if you're new to A Rocha, please check out our website, go visit one of our centers. Yes, you can do that even in COVID with a few precautions that you can read about. And you can certainly reach out to me. As I say, I'm Director of Theological Education. I'm interested in how churches and Christian organizations do the deeper work of reflection and study on how we live into these values theologically. So that's all I want to say about that. About these talks, this is our second talk, and so we welcome you to it. Bear with us. We're learning this crazy new frontier world of Zoom, and we're just delighted that you're joining us here today. Deep gratitude again to our panelists for joining in the conversation, to Barry and Joan and Karen and Liz. Thank you for being with us. I want to again just now say, if you have questions for the panelists, go ahead and begin to insert those into the chat now, and we'll kind of get a running tally. My colleague Rick is going to be monitoring those and sort of passing some of them on to me in time. So I hope you've all seen the film Godspeed, and if you haven't, again, please go and watch it. Let me just say a few quick summary points about it. It follows Matt Canlis, a young and driven pastor who sets off to do ministry, who finds his way to Scotland while supporting a wife through graduate school and takes a job at a local parish. We meet some of the main characters of his parish, and the notion that he is really kind of going back to school. He's entering a process of being formed. And what he principally discovers, I suggest, is that he needs to slow down. He needs to attend differently to his life here on planet Earth. He says at the beginning, this is the story of learning to walk instead of run. The story of people who taught me to slow down. The story of the freedom I found and the freedom that found me. And he discovers after years of seminary education that his relationship with the place and with the people is deeply interconnected. And being faithful to the people we find ourselves is central to his call as a minister. He tells the story of going to the small Scottish church and meeting the priest in charge and asking where the office is, and that he's turned around and faced outside and said, the parish, this is where you work. This is where you do it. Go and walk the parish and learn what it means to be a minister here. Which reminds me of a great little essay by Wendell Berry called Out of Your Car, Off Your Horse, where he says, if you want to know a place, we have to get out of our car, off our horse. We have to walk it. We have to feel it underneath us, because we are embodied creatures. We can only really thrive at a certain scale. And so these are just some of the insights that I think are so paramount to this beautiful film. I hope you've enjoyed it, and to the discussion that we're going to have. I won't say anything more about the film, but I think it's the interplay of caring for people, yes, people under his care as shepherd, as pastor, but also the place itself that I think is the inspiration, and in some sense, the kind of knowing of those is part of what makes us more human. So I'm going to ask a few quick questions to our panelists as a way of them introducing themselves. I don't have long prepared introductions, and then we'll dive into some more broader questions. So Barry and Joan, welcome. Thank you for being with us. I want to start with you. I met you both on a course several years ago, a theological course on food. And I know that you had been on a journey in your own life and in your home and in your marriage, exploring these things, which I know took you even further in terms of your vocation and commitments to living as neighbors in a specific place. So I want to give you both a chance, share a few of your thoughts and tell us a bit about that journey. What sort of taught you the art of neighboring, if you like, and how are you living that out in your neighborhood in Vancouver?
Sure, I'll start, and Barry, you can jump in. We're in the same house, but in different rooms. So just to give you a bit of context, we live in Vancouver. We're on a very major artery. Lots of cars pass our house every day. It's a busy neighborhood. In our neighborhood, people rarely use the front door of their houses. It's all through the back doors. We don't even have a key to our front door. The house just didn't come with one. And there's lots of hedges and fences, and our homes are very private places, very isolated from each other. And we've also got quite a lot of condos now going up in our neighborhood. So that's just furthering that isolation. I think Barry and I were living that way as well. We were leaving our house in our separate cars, going to work, leaving our house in our cars to go to church, leaving our house in our cars to go shopping, and go for entertainment and exercise, everything, socializing was all outside of our house. And we come home, we come in the back door, and that's about it. Come into our private home and retreat. And so it was in 2012 that we heard about the Vancouver Foundation's Connect and Engagement report that stated, as in most urban centers, that social isolation was the #1 social issue in our city. And we heard some examples of friends of ours who held a Christmas drop-in wine and cheese party. And at this party, they had neighbors living together for up to 30 years. They had been neighbors, and they met like formally, had a first conversation at this party. And we kind of looked at each other and said, you know, that's kind of us. Like, we've been living in this house for 10 years and we don't know anybody. We know the names of 2 people that live directly behind our lane, but we don't really know them. We just know their names. And a drop-in Christmas party, we could try that. We should try that. So that's how we started, with a simple idea. And we, you know, mail slotted invitations to everybody, and
it's about 20 homes.
About 20 homes,
yeah.
And 2 people came, the 2 names that we knew. And so we thought about this and realized that, you know, we don't know them and they don't know us. So why would they go into someone's home if there's absolutely no connection? So we just started making some small changes in our lives to make those connections. So some things that we did were, we just started being present outside. So we went out the front door and we went for intentional walks. We forced ourselves to say hello to everybody that we saw. And it was awkward and uncomfortable at first. And Barry also built a garden box right in the front of our, like on our sidewalk. So on the, like in front of our house. And for the purpose of sharing food and hoping to inspire others to grow food. And that was really weird too. And people thought we were weird. And so, but it invited a curiosity and connection with people who passed by. And a couple of things we noticed was that actually the front of our house had a huge volume of pedestrian traffic that we had no idea, because we just stay inside. So we did that. We also pulled back a little bit on our church commitments. So we noticed that a lot of the weekday nights were being taken up by church things. And we, you know, we both work full time. We were tired. And so we just didn't have time or energy to do anything in our neighborhood. So we changed that. And we also cut our cable TV. And we found that watching games, hockey games and entertainment, really for our downtime, was really taking time away from how we could be spending it in our neighborhood. So a couple things like that. And then from there, as we got to know people, we decided to host more like outside the house events. And instead of mail slotting the invitations, we went and knocked on the door. And we said, we're Barry and Joan. We live at that house with the crazy garden in the front, and we'd love to have you join us for an open mic night or Fire Pit Friday. And so slowly over the last 8 years, we've been living into that presence and loving it. Just feeling like instead of taking things away from our life, I would say that we live very fulfilled lives and are loving that. And like in the movie, it's a little bit slower. It takes time, and that's great. Barry?
Thank you.
You know, I mean, the only thing I have to add is that 8 years ago, neighbors didn't know each other. They were inside, and now we see neighbors, not just the interaction with Joan and myself, but with each other. They lean over the fence, they go to each other's backyard, and they share. They say, can I help you with your car, change your tires or whatever. And so there's definitely been a change in posture and just outlook in terms of the block that we share with all our neighbors. So, and it is gratifying to see that change. And as Joan said, it's been a very slow process.
Lovely. Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful story, and lots we can learn from you in it. Liz, I want to move on to you. You're kind of the panelist I'm least familiar with, but I'm grateful you've joined us. And we did meet briefly at a conference here in Victoria a few years ago, and I know a bit about your work through the Catholic Worker. I know of it generally, I don't know of your specific work, but I'm curious, how might you narrate your own work, both at the Catholic Worker and more generally, and how this notion of slowing down, of sort of Godspeed and neighboring, how has that kind of been formed in you? And tell us a bit about how you're living that out where you are.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my husband Paul and I have lived in Tacoma for, I don't know, 20 years or something, and so we've been in this area for a while, and we were doing a lot of postures and practice of listening to our place, listening, looking, watching who's here, what's going on, who are the groups that are making a difference, how are people collecting together, what's interesting to people. And along that journey, we met this Catholic Worker community, and they've been here for 30 some years. Father Bix, Bill Bixel, he started this community. He's a Jesuit priest, so it's got Jesuit roots. I'm not, by the way, I'm not Catholic, and I don't have to be. So it's kind of an interesting mixture of people here. But a lot of the Catholic Worker presence is about what are the needs, the greater needs of the place. And where we are here, there's a lot of kind of a mixture of a lot of marginalized. So we unfortunately have a immigrant detention center in the Tide Flats of Tacoma. So we often, a Catholic Worker is a transition space. It's a transitional housing. And so we often have many people that come and live with us from different countries. We have people that there's a very strong presence of mental illness on our block. There's a lot of people with drug addiction, a lot of homelessness. And so as we've been listening to our place, we have discovered this group of people that have really lived out this presence of listening to how is God active and present in this place, and what can we learn from it. And oftentimes it's very uncontrolled, which is very opposite than what I've learned and grew up with. It's very much about holding space and being with, not telling people how to live out their religious faith. It's about presence and the slowness. Godspeed video is so cool this way, like the slowness of looking at a person that's across from you, sharing a meal. What's your story? What's it about? And then just like surrendering to that part of saying, I don't need to be understood. I'd just like to understand what's your story. Tell me a bit about you. And find the commonality, not the difference. You know, how can we meet in this step? How can we meet? And it's, I was watching this practice of people for a long time, and now kind of living, we've lived in this house for 4.5 years, and just kind of just watching these lives of people that have done this for a while, it just kind of washes over you over time. And then you kind of start going, oh, this is, okay, so slow and easy. Okay, don't control that conversation. Oh, invite this to be, but it's very chaotic at the same time, and very uncontrollable and very edgy. And you don't know when you walk outside your door, who are you going to interact with? And a lot of it's delightful, and a lot of it's scary, and a lot of it's unknown. So it's a very interesting way of living, but I really just know God is, I see God so much more in every day, just by some of those practices, I think, of that presence and listening to the people, and how different they are is an invitation for me to listen to how God is active. And we also have this big garden in the center of these houses, and we garden together, and sometimes people want to learn, and then they tell stories about, oh, I used to grow this as a kid, or, and so you kind of have that medium too. So the land invites us to be present together too. So it's beautiful. Yeah.
Thank you, Liz. That is beautiful. Okay, Karen, you're next. I've known you a bit longer, and you serve with us on the board for A Rocha. I know these issues are a concern for your work in ministry. You are, to sort of out, you hear publicly, you're an ordained person, although you work in a pretty non-traditional setting. So tell us a little bit about that life, what that life of ministry looks like for you, and how you've come to care about and really try and embody some of these concerns in your neighborhood.
Thanks, Matt. It's been a very lovely adventure. Not anything I could have premeditated or anticipated. I had pastored in a traditional setting for a couple decades, and it was my denomination that had asked if I would kind of pioneer, an incarnational mission. They didn't really know what that meant, and I'm in the urban center in Vancouver, right in the city. And I had lived most of my life on adrenaline and deadlines. I was very productive. And within a very short period of time of wanting to move to a place where I would start to take serious, to love God by loving my neighbors, I realized that you couldn't be busy and be present to people. And so really it took my first year and a half. There was many conversions personally that's happened in me, as in the movie that was reflected. But one of them was learning to live slowly, moving at the pace of being known. And that was like the first year and a half was just radically foreign to how I'd lived most of my life. And, I wanted to kind of connect with neighbors, and then also moving away from a professionalized role. It's always interesting to me that neighbor and homemaker are two roles that have never been professionalized. And so not relating to a neighbor as a project or someone to serve or minister to, but simply inviting them into friendship, into your life like Jesus does. That was a significant shift. It seems pretty normal, but actually intentionally seeking friendship with neighbors. And that takes time, and you can't control that. And neighbors in a busy life become optional relationships. And so I began simply by attempting to get to know people. Lots of my neighbors had been there 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So I was kind of the new kid on the block. Started having open houses, and then I started soup nights maybe 8 years ago. And slowly it became the connection point for the neighborhood. We would I would get small grants also from the Vancouver Foundation. We'd do progressive dinners or movie nights at the local parish, which is half a block away from me. And we eventually developed an email list. I don't know, we have over 100 now on our email list. And so most neighbors would say that they hadn't known more than 2 or 3 neighbors. And so then I would say now people have even exchanged some house keys. And after a few years, we eventually worked together to sponsor a Syrian refugee family from Damascus. We raised $50,000 as a neighborhood. So we started to work together. So it has been this very slow process for me of learning to live deeper, slower. I don't have a car anymore. I use a bike as my transport. I live probably 90% of my life within a 30-minute walk. So it has been a radical shift on how I've lived most of my life, and I would never go back. I'm having a blast at this stage and age of my life. So yeah, it's moved me away from a thinking of just how can I know a few neighbors' names, but actually how can I, if to love God is to love neighbors, I started to reflect on what does it mean, what would it take for me to enjoy my neighbors as a way to enjoy God, as a way to get to know what God's doing by getting to know my community more deeply. And so that was a slow revelation of many conversions that required, but Even now with COVID, I realize how very little adaptation I've had to do, where my life is now centered around home and neighborhood.
Lovely. Thank you. So a number of questions coming into the chat. So thank you all for those. Please continue to feel free to do that as we go. I guess my first question I have for you, one of the sort of elephants in the room for me in watching the film is how we've been socialized into mobility. You know, we move a lot, and also a certain pace and a certain drivenness and speed. And Matt says very early on in the film, I've been running most of my life, running through, right? It's like we're running through a place, but we're not sort of slowing and sinking down into it. And so it strikes me, for all of you, there has been this slowing and this sinking, and yet I'm also aware that to do that, you've probably had to give up some things, right? You've had to reorient yourself. So I'm just curious, some of you have already made mention of that, but thinking if any of you want to say anything more about that, how do you manage that tension? And I know some of you, you're driven people, right? It's not like the goal is sort of hang out and drink tea, and yet hanging out and drinking tea is a big part of what many of you do, I'm sure. So how do you manage some of that inside of you, the urge and the drive, and yet this growing awareness of slowing and sinking and paying attention? How does that maybe look?
I think one of the conversations over years ago, which I know I've had with Karen and with Barry and Joan too, is just this part when you know that you can kind of go through a neighborhood and not feel the weight of the lives in a particular place. You start, like, when you see your neighborhood, what are the strengths that are already there? Like, instead of going to the grocery store on the other neighborhood, going to the grocery store in your neighborhood, or going to the bakery that's down the street, or the coffee shop, or like frequenting the spots that add to your particular neighborhood and starting there. And then if they don't, if your neighborhood doesn't have that, then accessing what's next. But I think some of those practices of putting your money in your local spot and that kind of thing was very, very simple, and something I think I started doing a while ago. And so I think that helps slow everything down, and you can see people's face a little better when you don't have to rush off somewhere else and spend a half hour to go someplace.
Yeah, I would add too that this isn't about really time management, because I was the queen of multitasking. I could cram in as much, and I kind of used to feel sorry for people that couldn't, cram in as much. So it required a shift of almost renouncing of value. I began to reject multitasking as a value, and so there was shifts on several levels that had me, and one primary was that God was the primary agent. I was a witness and a participant, but I think I would have assented to that theologically before, but in practice, it was, I'm strategic, I'm an initiator, I'm a planner, an organizer, and asking God to kind of bless that, versus this posture that, seeing that Jesus primarily ministered in serendipitous moments, and this highly relational hospitality theme that you see throughout the New Testament. And so this was the shift that's saying that God's out ahead of us and we're joining in what he's already doing. This is God's work. It's his deal. I didn't bring God into the neighborhood. So then that requires a different posture of listening and being attentive to what is God up to. Where are there evidences and signs of the kingdom and absence of that? So it's a different internal posture of listening, and also this release of burden that, I had to convert all my neighbors. The call was to love them well, to invite them into friendship and invite them into your life. And yes, it required choices around prioritizing and dropping some things like Joan had mentioned. You know, I needed a lot. It took that first couple of years where I kept saying, I need more margin. I need more margin. So but it was a reshifting of not only values and priorities, but this shifting of thinking that really began the process. Because otherwise, it's very potentially that we can just have yet one more thing that we feel guilty about, that we should do better and manage better.
Yeah.
I just, go ahead, Joan.
I would say too, Karen, that when we started shifting, it wasn't that we were looking for something else to get in our life. Another area of ministry. Like,
Yeah.
It's not about adding something in. It was about, if God's already working in the neighborhood that I live in, then how can I shift my daily practice so that my life intersects with the lives of those around me?
Yes.
So that I can be known and I can get to know others.
Yes.
Because if God's already doing that, then how can I do that? So one of the things that we did was, like, literally we opened up our front, in front of our house, which had these big bushes. It was beautiful, and it was supposed to hide the noise and the people. So you could just be in your own little house and retreat. And so we started changing the way we viewed our home as not a place of retreat, but a place that we could actually extend our living space into the front of our home. And that would be a place where we could actually say hi to people.
Mm-hmm. Good.
I was just going to say, in terms of that shift in value that you were talking about, Karen, and I had this conversation with Karen when I went through this. So it was about maybe 4 years ago. I left work, and my values, my identity was wrapped around my work in a tech company. And it was hard. It was like, am I going to leave work? I was going to take this year off, this sabbatical, to discern. And work was, I guess, life-giving. But what I've realized, or what Joan pointed out to me, was that when I was in the front of the house gardening and I met with neighbors and I had an interaction with them, however, it could have been small talk, but it gave me so much life. And I'm more of an introvert than an extrovert, but she saw that change in me, where when I was just having this conversation with the stranger, with the neighbor, it was life-giving. And so there goes, me and a stranger, and we go off no longer being anonymous to each other, but we're known to each other now. And I also see that as sort of, as I get to know that stranger, I taste the image of God, the Imago Dei, in this person, and hopefully that person will see the Christ in me. So it's been really transformative. And as you said, Karen, your mini conversion, that's been one of my conversions, is that these neighbors, these strangers that I interact with are changing me, are transforming me, because they are made in the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. I would certainly want to underline many of you have made that. I think there's a way of hearing even this conversation. Certainly, my experience with working with A Rocha now for 10 years. There's a way of hearing some of this, or people receiving it as, here's another thing you need to care about and go and work on and do. And it's such a transformation to say, no, here's how we understand God to be at work in the world. Here's how we understand the kinds of things God is doing and investing in. And there's just an invitation into that based on your gifts and your setting and your context. So I would really reiterate that. Related to that, I think I interact with a lot of folks who are very passionate about the world, very overwhelmed with its problems and wanting to, make some difference, and discerning how to do that. And I think there might be two extremes that I find in that. One is just getting so swept up with a kind of fog of overwhelming scale of problems. And I think all of your stories embody a real alternative to that. is it possible though we also think, well, maybe we're thinking too little in our neighborhood, you know, or are we sort of creating our little fiefdom of concern and not caring about broader issues? And so how do you navigate that interplay where there are deep concerns that are systemic and structural, and yet also looking your neighbor in the eye and caring? How does that come together in some of your experiences?
Well, I would say because our neighborhood is full of people, it's full of people who have cares about the world and have concerns and burdens and are out there being active in them. And so if I'm, you know, like we went on a walk once just in the pandemic, and we met one of our neighbors that we had never met before. And we just said, hello, we love your garden. And she's like, come here and see. And so we kept our social distance, but she wanted to show like the bamboo that was taking over her yard and how she was doing all this work herself. And she's, you know, I don't know, maybe in her 60s, late 60s. And so now every time we go by, she'll like invite us to see a different part of her garden. The last time was in the backyard. So she had to open the fence for us. And we went in, and that's where we heard about her passion for what's happening in Hong Kong. And she told us these stories about being in these marches and having guns pointed at her head, and how that causes her to have post-traumatic stress right now. And we were like, wow, like, you know, we pray for Hong Kong. So we're going to join you in caring about what's happening in that part of the world. I don't know. It just came from saying, hi, we love your garden. And then you go deeper and you find out. So I think by listening to, you know, really being attentive to what, like, you know, like has been said already, like what are you caring about? And let me listen to that.
And once you go deeper into friendship with people, my neighborhood has a lot of some of the most activist artists, highest concentration of artists in the country. So they're a very engaged neighborhood. And so you have lots of very strong opinions and people that are very engaged in a variety of social issues. So part of it is, as Joan says, is the more that you press into relationship with people, you then are engaging around all those things. One cool thing that the Vancouver Foundation started a couple of years ago was a little project called On the Table. And they were intentionally inviting people to initiate an intentional conversation with 4 to 8, 10 neighbors, and to pick a topic and to have an intentional conversation. So our first one we did a couple of years ago with, I don't know, 8 or 9 of our neighbors, was how to have life-giving conversation amongst polarized viewpoints. And people came prepared to engage and chat. So these intentional conversations that they're wanting to actually engage upon and put into practice. Certainly the issues around Syria, that has been a dominant conversation in our neighborhood, and several sponsorships that have happened. So I think it's as you develop enough social connection that then you can begin to coalesce and work together for the common good and put your hand to something that collectively you feel a sense as a neighborhood to put your hand toward, whether it's something systemic in your community or something beyond that.
Great. Thank you. And another question, Matt talks about the vulnerability of becoming known in a small place, right? And being quite shocked at the way that some of his neighbors knew one another, you know, across generations. And he calls the parish a fishbowl. And I'm wondering if you have any experience of this sort of fishbowl of being known and of being vulnerable, and what that's been like for you in your setting.
It's very uncomfortable, actually, isn't it, to be in a in that apart and just like feeling like you're being exposed. How you do things is not maybe valued. Maybe there's a collective in your place that values something else, and you realize, oh, not necessarily that you're doing it wrong, but that there's an invitation to try something different. I wonder, just there's I think being in that, there's an invitation of like curiosity. What would it be like if I decided to not, you know, do this, assume I have it, like, you know, relating to Matt Canlis, like that I don't have an office. What would I do with myself? You know, how would I spend my time slowing down? Like, I'm not sure if I would knock on people's doors, you know, but as soon as people are outside, I'd probably go and talk to them. But even that's still kind of a little different. So what's the challenge, and what's the curiosity of looking outside of your regular comfortability and just trying something, I suppose. But that that's not a very comfortable space to be in, for sure. That fishbowl being in.
Thank you.
But it's tied together. You know, I used to say in pre-marriage counseling that intimate relationships don't create problems, they reveal them. You know, they hold up the mirror. And part of this move for me was also to move from living alone most of my life to intentionally living in community. So I'm in a 100-year-old house with 6 bedrooms, and have moved into an intentional intergenerational community house. That's something I had never done before. And so lots of learning curve in that, and lots of hard work in it. No romanticizing of it, but I would never go back. And so I think that's a microcosm of what is experiencing in the neighborhood, the gift of being known and accepted. You know, when you show a little bit of yourself and you see people don't run away, and then you show a little bit more of yourself and people don't run away, and that's where you really start to believe that God loves you unconditionally, when you actually experience that with other people. And so we can live very isolated lives in many ways, certainly even within the church communities. And so that's also a major ingredient for loneliness. So it is that risk, it's that joy. And so I think that's what Neighbours invite us into, to move beyond just a surface where we might know a name, to actually be known. And knowing others in that way too. So one of my measuring is like, how many house keys would I entrust to my neighbors? I started keeping my front door unlocked, and it took a couple of years where enough neighbors felt comfortable enough to now walk in and put the tea kettle on. We're having to navigate that with COVID, but that was a slow process of relearning. And I think what should be normal human behavior, and people that grew up in small towns, that was normalized. We've normalized isolation and fear in our houses as refuges, versus that generous space of hospitality and trust, and not where we're entertaining people and impressing them with how things look or how we are, but hospitality where we're inviting them into our life, whether it's messy or chaotic or hurting, so they see us in our life journey. And so there's great joy and contentment and deep satisfaction in that, but it's also risky.
Thank you. Yeah, let me pick up on a few pieces of your answers there. I guess one, we've had a handful of questions around engaging this work if you are an introvert, or if you are married to an introvert or partnered with an introvert. And I guess, you know, somewhat connected to that, beyond, you know, how we sort of identify ourselves and cores of our personality, is the awareness that to give the right kind of energy to this, we probably have to pull some of that energy from somewhere else, whether we're an introvert or an extrovert. And I've heard in each of your stories, actually, the different ways that you have come into this, a real sense that you weren't giving something up, you were actually kind of redevoting your attention and your resources. So answers to that, both about being an introvert, I know some of you may identify that way, but also about just that application of your life and energy and what that has looked like, I think would help us.
If I can just, I mean, that's a good question. And, you know, earlier on in our engagement with neighbors, we had gatherings, barbecues, potlucks. And yeah, there was a certain element of our neighborhood that just like, I don't go to those things, and because they're an introvert. And one of the things that we did, and we didn't realize this, it wasn't intentional. Again, you know, Karen talked about the small grants. We got some grant money to work on a project that I think some of you in Victoria are familiar with, and that's pole painting in the Fernwood district. We were inspired by that. So we thought, well, we have 4 utility poles in our backyard, and let's get the neighbors to
In our back lane.
In our back lane, yeah. And we got some of them to participate in that. And there were neighbors that never came to any of these social events, but they came out to paint. And because it was more kind of a solitary effort in terms of painting and using their artistic skills, and we got to know neighbors that way too. And so, yeah, there's different ways that you can certainly engage with the introverts.
Others?
Yeah, one of the things that scriptures that God invites us into, you know, God knows humans like no one who knows humans, and knows how we're wired. And I think one of the things that probably this journey has deepened my freedom to be who I am, because it's not shaped around position or an identity attached to something else. So really, it's just who you are. And so I think that it has wooed me as I've deepened relationship with neighbors, that they don't know me in a role. They only know me as Karen. And so that frees me to be more free in who I am. And so this isn't personality based. I think there's things you might negotiate, especially in partners where one might be more keen to have, you know, parties every night of the week. But I think there's a way for us to find expression that works within our different energy levels. How do you manage that in a way that's sustainable and good stewardship? And so we've navigated that in our household because we have people that are introverts and extroverts, and some that just put their boundaries up at different places, and we honor that. But there's still this value that says it might look differently on how you deepen relationship with neighbors. So the intentionality is the same, but the energy or the expression of that just looks differently, and there's room for that.
Yeah, I would say if you're living authentically, then you live who you are, right? It's as you share your life with others, and as others share their lives with you, that's where the reality is. That's where real stuff happens. You know, one time Barry and I, we grow garlic in the front yard, and we share that with our neighbors. So it was dried and cured, and we were taking garlic to some close friends' neighbors, and their neighbors next door heard us. They had just gotten back from the library with their kids, and so they like, "Hello, Joan and Barry, and what are you doing there?" And so then we met in the lane, and I was like, "Oh, we just dropped garlic off with your oldest son." And, you know, she came out with like these moon cakes. I think it was moon cakes or some homemade, you know, Taiwanese treat. And we were she shared this with us, and it was under the full moon. And just happenstance, she just happened to share this powerful story about a difficulty in her family with, you know, an in-law. And I was having a very similar issue. And we both just started weeping because it was so painful. But here we were, we found something in common. And it was just so beautiful. And we, you know, we came back inside, and I said to Barry, I think we just had church together, because here we are breaking these mooncakes together, weeping and sharing life together. And it was like, well, I was purely myself, you know. You know, recently my family went through a huge tragedy, and my neighbors knew it. And it's like I didn't have to hide. I could just be myself, and they helped me. You know, so it's just, I think authentic living just leads to really truly being who we are. And both Barry and I are introverts. That's why it was so painful at first when he kept saying, let's go for a walk. Let's cross the street. There's people coming on the other side. And I was like, what are you doing?
Let me just ask a related question to that. I guess I'll say more about this at the end, but one of our upcoming talks is going to be really on the idea of grief, of ecological grief, but broader grief. I've been reading a great book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Francis Weller, who's a kind of psychologist and does work on grief. But he keeps coming back to this point that we humans, we grew up and matured and evolved, whatever word you want to use, to live in a village. And he says what we expect when we wake up in the morning is to look out and see somewhere between sort of 30 and 70 sets of eyes looking back in ours, right? That know us and remind us of who we are, of where we've come from, of why we belong. And he sort of says, you know, you contrast that with the expectations we've laid on the nuclear family, right? Many of which, all of ours, in some degree or other, are quite fractured or broken. So it strikes me in hearing many of you that actually all of you have found ways of living differently. I mean, Karen mentioning you have, you know, in a house with 6 bedrooms, and Barry and Joan, I know you've had others living with you in various arrangements. So I'm wondering about this notion of a village, of the community that's kind of forming around what you're doing. And connected to that, there's a question, I guess, around, can you, let me see if I can get the wording of this right. Can you cultivate sort of being a neighbor as an end to itself, or, you know, tying it to the work of a church or a project or some entity? Is that helpful or not? How do you maybe navigate that within the village that you're a part of? A couple of connected questions for you.
I was at the Catholic Worker here. There's we own about 8 to 10 houses, and they have different purposes, but they're right next to each other. And so we call it a village, and there is oftentimes a need of some sort by a neighbor, and I have no idea how to do plumbing. I have no idea how to fix a leaky faucet. But I have access to people. I can say, oh my goodness, something just happened. Can you come over and help? There's this, you know, it goes both ways. But my thought dropped right there. and you were asking about the village, and I was like, yes, it's a village conference, you know. But then you had coupled that with something. What was that part? The question.
Whether living this out as, you know, as part of an existing community or a church or some collective identity versus just doing this. How does that interplay maybe work?
Yes. So here there's a purpose. There's a purpose, a collective purpose of being available to people that are on the margins. So there's a mission here. There's a purpose, and we do that together. And nobody's expecting me to show up in all the perfect parts and wear all the hats. I'm one person and I'm not meant to be any more than what Liz is. And so my neighbor is the same, but absolutely has a completely different thing. And so that realization and that need of saying, I need my neighbor so I can live, so we can live this vision of life together, the purpose of being neighbors, like that part you were wondering about, like, could it be just that we're neighbors? Absolutely, you know, and just being able to share those parts of life and the grief and the things that were just brought up. And it helps to have an idea of pole painting in your back alley and having something to work on together to beautify your neighborhood, or being supportive of somebody that just lost somebody, or, you know, somebody's sick, can I go get you some groceries? And that, like, what kind of needs are present. But I think that the village conversation in a neighborhood context like this, anywhere, whether it's rural, suburban, in an urban environment like I am, it all works because we're calling on each other to show up. I need you to show up for me so I can keep living. I can't do this by myself. And that's still the same. It looks different than it was in Jesus' day, or you know, way further, but it's the same. It's exactly the same.
Well, one of the conversions of the many conversions I have also was this more integrated way of living. There's just much more overlap and much more holistic way. When you start, you know, rooting into a place, you start caring about the place. We call our house Parker House because it's on Parker Street. So this intentionality about caring about the place. So I think there is this sense that you're moving, not just in how do you have a few more friends in the neighborhood, but this, that God, that at the core, our belief in the gospel is that all people and all places will flourish, that God is bringing his kingdom to come on earth as it is in heaven, that all people and all places will flourish. That's what we live into, that reality, that is what God is at work doing now and is inviting us to join and participate in that work. So I think it is a Christian perspective that believes that that we are a part of that renewing work for all people in all places, and participating in that. So it's this larger imagination, this larger reality that anchors our life, really, that we are not hopeless people reading the newspaper, that we know that the true reality is what God is doing in the larger picture in bringing his kingdom to come. So I would say that. And part of that also is that we would, in faith, believe that we don't do this work alone. We're not individuals. So it could be that expressions of church might collect in neighborhoods. It might be through traditional churches. I think all of that right now, frankly, is up, being tossed in the air in these days. We wonder what gathering is going to look like. But we know those elements that we gather together for fellowship and worship and prayer. And so I think how those expressions happen, but that those should be a part of that. And we would be connected to that we wouldn't be islands on our own, but because it would be part of this larger vision of what we're putting our hand to. And really the idea of village has been a very clear picture that has sparked my imagination. The nuclear family is a relatively new concept.
Yeah.
And so this idea of intergenerational people you don't choose, you know, historically it was always that kinship, that relative and non-relative, that 40, 50, 60 people that was your village. And the pressure we've placed really on family units to be self-sufficient in themselves is a burden that we weren't meant to bear. And so I think actually moving deeper into neighborhood helps us restore a bit of that still in many communal cultures are still happening.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one final question, and then I have some comments to wrap us up. And that is this: that we see, I think, in a North American setting and culture, this kind of culture of mobility. People move a lot. They follow their work or their job or their schooling. There's a bit of a revolving door. And then you indeed even see that at the end of this film, that the Canlises, who are from a place, move back there, right? At the beginning of the film, Matt is speaking to Eugene Peterson, who says, you know, Matt says, where do I go? And he says, you may have to go farther than you think, like leave this continent to learn this. And I guess that leaves me with a question, or two questions that are very connected. One is the hope to live this out in a culture of deep mobility, but then connected to that is realizing that part of that means that we are surrounded with and relating to people who may leave, right? Who may transition. And I know, I'm sure all of you have been. I lived at A Rocha. We had a residential community and people coming and going all the time. And so how, you know, we can create a village, and yet part of that is always porous, and we're always interacting with that mobility. So I'm sort of curious how you maybe have seen that and reflected on that some with how it came up in the film. Barry and Joan, I know, for instance, your specific neighborhood, whilst no one is leaving, they are rapidly transforming it. And maybe you have more of a problem of too many people arriving in terms of the massive buildings that are replacing the old family homes. And does that present a different challenge for you in terms of your social location there?
Yeah, I mean, actually it's both, Matt. So, I mean, obviously, before the condos can go up, people have to be evicted.
Right.
And so we lament when we have invested and shared with people in the neighborhood. And yeah, I mean, I think we continue to make those connections, even though like within our block, there are several houses that are being rented temporarily until they get knocked down to build 4 to 8-story condos. But we continue to meet with these people that may be leaving in the next few months or year. And our hope is that they see the value in making those connections, even though there's no longevity to it for them anyways, and certainly for us. And we also recognize too that for us living here, it's a privilege. I mean, most people don't have that option to be rooted and to stay in one place as much as they would like to. And some of the neighbors in our that have lived here, they wanted to stay here, but because they were evicted, they had to leave. So there is that tension and that reality, and also the reality that there are more neighbors now that are coming in. Just 2 houses away from us, there's 50 new condos. They'll be moving in August 22nd, and we'll have new neighbors, and we look forward to meeting them. And there certainly has been a tension too in terms of, well, those neighbors, the new ones versus the established ones. And so for us, we try to be the peacemakers too, to say, look, those people have just as much right to live here as you have, who've been established here for 30, 40 years. And so, so there is still work to be done, and there's tensions and there's challenges, but we still remain faithful to being present with whoever comes our way. Because we know at the end, as Karen has said, that, you know, it's God's agency. He has a purpose for all of this. And maybe it is rubbing shoulders with these people for a small period of time, and they'll see that value in making those connections wherever they land.
Thank you. Any others want to answer that question? Great. Well, I want to thank you all very much. Thank you, Joan, Barry, Liz, Karen, all of you, for your stories, for your witness, for your words to us. It's a delight to hear, and I've been inspired. I've heard some of these stories before, and I'm deeply inspired by you, and I want to bless you and encourage you in the work that you're doing. Thanks to all who are joining us here. I want to give you a few very, very quick announcements, and then I have one little story to close. Thank you again, as I said, on behalf of A Rocha. I'm going to put here into the chat our website. If you're not familiar with A Rocha, that's the place to go and find out more. I'm also going to put my email if you'd like to learn more about the work that we're doing, about the talks. I'm happy to be a resource for you there. That's available to you. We are going to send out a very brief, it's very quick little evaluation to help us improve these talks. We have more planned, and we'd love to learn from you on that. And on that point, the next talk in September, we haven't got a date yet, but we do have a talk planned on ecological grief, on how do we care for a planet that is under great distress, and we feel that deeply inside of ourselves. You may know the quote from Aldo Leopold that one of the effects of an ecological education is to live alone in a world of wounds. And so we each encounter that differently. We have confirmed for that panel at this point is Hannah Malcolm, who's a PhD candidate in the UK and a ordinand in the Church of England, and who is editing a book on a theology of grief around climate. And she's inviting some of those editors to join. It'll be a very good and moving conversation. So get on our email list, find out more about that. The recording of this conversation today will be made available on our YouTube page in the coming days. So feel free to share and to review that. The last thing I just want to mention, I've had a question in the chat here about this little icon over my shoulder, which here, I'll just take it down because this is in some ways very, very fitting. Will probably be familiar to, to many of our panelists. This is an icon of the story of Jesus' encounter on the road to Emmaus. And so I've put in my A Rocha plug, I'll put in a little plug. I'm part of a community in Victoria called the Emmaus Community. You can Google and find out about us. But this is a story of two people, likely a couple, traveling a road from into Emmaus, and they encounter there a stranger who comes and asks them about what has happened. And they begin to share some of their story, and they say, "Why don't you come in? It's late, have a bit of a meal." And the stranger says, "Oh no, don't make a fuss for me." And then they convince this person to come in. And lo and behold, in the midst of the meal, of the sharing of this act of hospitality, they discover that they're not actually the host at all, that they're the guests, and that the host is Jesus himself resurrected, who is in their midst, and they didn't yet know it. And so it's a great, I think, it's a great anchor point for this whole conversation that we've had, that what we are seeking to respond to is the invitation that we have been given, is the way that we've been received and welcomed into God's hospitality and economy. And so I want to bless all of you who are watching, who are joining for this conversation, to remain anchored in that miraculous story of God who has moved into our neighborhood, who is among us, who does inspire the work that we do. So deep gratitude again to you all for joining us. And we say thank you and God bless you today and always.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.